Hey YouTube! Today we're going to be learning about integers and floating point variables. We're going to learn how to declare them in Python, different operations we can do with them, and we're going to use them in some examples. We're going to make an area calculator as well as a number guessing game. Let's get into it. First, let's talk about integers. So integers are whole numbers. They can be positive, they can be negative, include zero, but they can't have a fractional component. If they have a fractional component, then those fall under floating point numbers, which are numbers in Python that have a decimal place. So let's first, we're going to use IDLE, which is the IDE that I showed you how to use in a previous video. So if you want to fire that up, create a new file. I called mine numbers.py. You can call it whatever you'd like. And we're going to declare an integer variable. So we're going to say my_int is equal to 12. And again, because Python is not a statically typed language, we don't have to declare what type the variable is. We just give a variable name and we assign it the value 12, and Python will automatically assume that we want to create an integer variable. And integer variables support a variety of operations, all the ones that come from standard math operations. So if we, for example, were to print out the result of my int plus 3, I'm using Control S to save and then F5 to run my code. We can see that 12 plus 3 is 15. So we can do addition. We can also do subtraction. Gives us 9. We can do multiplication. Gives us 36. We can do exponentiation. So we can go my int to the power of some number. So if I say 12, we're going to use 2 asterisks to mean to the power of. So that is 12 squared is what we're computing. We get 144. And so those are some basic operations. The reason I left division for last is because there's actually 2 types of divisions in Python. There is integer division, which will only return an integer, and it's denoted by 2 slashes. So if I run this, we see that it outputs 6. Now, this is as we'd expect. But if I was to divide 12 by something like 5, now we would expect that it's going to result in a fractional number. However, because this is integer division, it will not consider the fractional remainder. It will just say, okay, 5 goes into 12 twice, and it'll return 2, as we see here. And so if you want to get that remainder, or if you want to do the division and get the most precise result, use floating point division, which is a single slash. And here we get a floating point number returned, which is 2.4. Another thing to note is that if you ever want to find the remainder after an integer division, what you can do is you can use the modulus operator, which is the % sign in Python. So this will essentially do a division by 5, and then it'll see how many are left over after that division that did not fit in evenly. So this, we're actually going to change the number just so it doesn't input 2 again. It would show us nothing. But there we go. We did 13 divided by 5, or sorry, modulo 5, and that will give us 3, as we expect, because that's the remainder. Now, this is how you work with integers. Floating points are extremely similar. We define them in the exact same way, except we just give them a value that contains a decimal place. So if I say my float is equal to 3.5, then Python will see it as a decimal place and assign it a float type. So if we print my float with some operations on it, we can do the same things we did with the integer. So if I add 3 to it, we can see that'll give us 6.5. And we can do subtraction, just the same. We can do multiplication, we can do exponentiation, so we can say 3.5 to the power of 3 gives us 42 and some change. And then also comes division. So we can do floating point division, which is a single slash, and that'll give us the decimal places in the result. We can also do integer division, but with a float. And you might ask how this works. Well, basically, it'll do the exact same thing. It'll say how many times does 3 fit evenly in 3.5? Well, it fits once. And because we're using floats in the operation, it's actually going to return the answer as a float. So it's going to say 1.0 instead of an integer 1. And this so works if we have some floating point numbers. So 3.5 integer division 3.2, it only fits in once, so that's what that returns. Yeah, so those are some of the operations that you might need to do on integers and floats. There is one more kind of shorthand syntax for operations. Let's say you wanted to increase the value of my float or my int by 5. So what you could do is you could say, okay, my int is equal to 13. And then later in your program, you say my int is equal to my underscore int plus 3. And so what this does is establishes the value, and then it says, okay, I'm going to reassign the variable my int to be the result of my current value plus 3. And so that will increment by 3. So here, if we run this, it should print out 16. And we see that there. There's actually a shorthand to do this even quicker. What we can do is we can go plus equals. And so this Python will interpret this sign as meaning I would like to add 3 to the value of my int. And so if we run this, we also see my int is now 16. And this works with subtraction as well, multiplication and division. So we can go times equals 3. We get 39. Yeah, so those are some basic operations using floats and integer values in Python. So with that understood, let's hop into some examples. So the first example I'm going to go over is going to be a simple calculator to calculate the area of a rectangle. So first we are going to get the width and the length of the rectangle from the user. So we're going to create a variable that's going to store the width, and we're going to say it's equal to the input function, which is going to give the user a prompt that we're going to say. So we're going to say, what is the width? And we're going to say length is also going to be the result of the input function when we ask them, what is the length? Then we're going to do the calculation of area. So area is equal to width times length. And then we're going to print out the results. We're going to say print, and I'm going to want to insert values into this string when I print it. So I'm going to use an F to indicate we're going to use string formatting. And then my string, which is area, is equal to curly braces to insert a value, insert the value in the area variable, close the string, close the brackets, and this should be good to go. Except there's one tricky thing to note, and so if I run this, we're actually going to get an error. What is the width? 3. 3. What is the length? 4. We get an error that it can't multiply strings. And this is because the input function will return a string. So basically the user types in a string and Python doesn't try to convert it to anything because you didn't ask it to, because it might not be able to be converted to an integer. So what we're going to do, because we're going to assume that the user is going to input a number, the number might have decimal places. So we're actually going to convert the string input into a float before we do the multiplication. So now Python will know that the input that they gave us is not just a string, but it can be converted to a floating point number. And so obviously if they input a character like A in their number, that will cause an error, but we don't expect our users to do that. So we run it again. What is the width? 3. Length? 4. Area is 12. And so there we go. A simple calculator that can calculate the area of a rectangle using some floating point operations. Now let's hop into the second example. This one uses more integers, and it's a little bit more complicated. What we're going to be doing is we're going to make a little game where the user has to guess a number between 1 and 10. So if you'd like to save this code, you can absolutely make sure you save this file and then go File, New File, and start with the next example in a new file. I'm going to type over this for now, but you can absolutely save it. So what we're going to do, first we're going to import random, because I don't want to know the number every time, I want it to change. So we're going to import the random library. And the way import statements work is you always say import, and then you say the name of the library. Python comes with a variety of libraries that aren't available by default because it'd just be a lot of commands in the base language, but they always come included with Python. Random is one of those libraries that always come included. You can also install other libraries that are made by the community, which is really awesome, but that's for a later day. Anyways, let's start by printing a welcome message. We're going to print welcome to the number guessing game. We're going to keep track of the number of tries that it takes them to get the correct answer, and we're going to initialize that to be an integer with value 0. So variable name is equal to and a value. The user is going to make guesses, and we'll store their current guess in a variable. For now, we'll have it equal to none, which is the Python version of the empty value. It means nothing's there yet, and we'll update that variable to be an integer later. So we also need to set a goal. So goal is going to be equal to random, so that's the library we imported, dot randint, which is a function that will return a random integer between an upper and a lower bound. So we want the integer to be at least 1 and not more than 10. And so goal will be a random integer between 1 and 10. It'll be different every time we run the program, and so we won't know what to expect. Now, I'm going to use a while loop here. This is something that I'll explain in a future video, but for now, you can just type after me. Don't worry about the syntax too much. We'll go over it in detail later. Just focus on how the numbers are used in this example. So what we're going to do is we're going to say while, and then the condition of the while loop is going to be while the goal is not equal to the guess. So while they haven't guessed correctly, we are going to increment the number of tries with the plus equals operator that we talked about earlier. And we are going to get the guess from the user. So we're going to say guess is going to be reassigned to the result of the input function when we ask them, what is the number? And just like before, we don't want the number to be a string, we want it to be an integer. So we're going to use the int function, which is a function that will convert something to an integer. So we get their guess, and then we're going to print out a message depending if they guess too high or too low. So we're going to say if guess greater than goal, we're going to print too high. And elif guess is less than goal, we are going to print too low. And again, we're going to cover if statements in a future video, but for now, don't worry about the syntax too much. But basically, this allows us to execute one bit of code if something's true, and another bit of code if something else is true. And so in the case where they guess too high, we're going to tell them that. And in the case where they guess too low, we're going to tell them that. And if they guess just right, then we don't want to tell them anything in the loop, because once they get the guess right, the loop will end. So outside of the loop, which I'm going to, you know when outside of the loop starts, when you get back to the same indentation level. So I'm going back one indent, and I'm going to type a congratulations message. Congratulations. Print. And we're going to tell them that they won in however many tries it took them. So we're going to use an F to indicate a formatted string. We're going to say you won in the number of tries times. So now let's look at this script. What we have is an import random. This is importing the random library. Then we're printing a welcome message. We're going to count the number of tries it takes them, which at first is 0. Guess is none. And we initialize a random goal between 1 and 10. Then, while the goal is not correct, what we're going to do is we're going to increment the number of tries, and we're going to allow them to make a guess. And we're going to take that input, and we're going to convert it to an int. And then, depending if the guess is too high or too low, we're going to give them that feedback, And then once the goal is the guess, so they've guessed correctly, we tell them how many tries it took them. So with that, let's run our program and see if that works. Welcome to the number guessing game. What is the number? I'm going to guess 5, too high. So I'm going to guess 3, too low. So it must be 4. Congratulations, you won in 3 times. So today we've looked at integers and floating point numbers. We've looked at how we can define them, do different operations on them, and we've used 2 kind of real-world examples of how you might use these variables. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope it was helpful, and I look forward to seeing you in future videos. Cheers!